Naomi Wolf, author, journalist, and activist, thank you for sitting down with RT today.
It's always a pleasure, Marina.
My first question for you. Recently, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced and ordered Pentagon officials to begin monitoring major news stations in the U.S. to see if any media outlets are disclosing classified information. As a journalist and as an American, what is your take on this?
I mean, you know, my immediate take is a profound feeling of nausea and a sense that somehow the United States has collapsed into, you know, the Soviet Union circa sort of mid-30s. This is horribly foreseeable, but I can't believe it's come to this. The Bush administration began this trajectory sort of 7 or 8 years ago by saying, okay, we're going to start to reactivate the Espionage Act. And they threatened to go after the New York Times, you may remember, when they broke the SWIFT banking story about how, at that time it seemed so quaint, how the government was monitoring people's private financial transactions. But what's so dangerous, what I've been warning people about for years, is that journalists' job is to publish classified information. Journalists, like, first of all, this is a White House, now 2 White Houses, Obama's and Bush's, which is systematically overclassifying everything, especially wrongdoing, especially anything related to what whistleblowers want to release, especially you know, torture that they've engaged in, methods of torture, fraud, corruption. They're classifying it. You know, I've had conversations with representatives, legal representatives of people in Guantanamo, who tell me that they can't tell me how their clients have been tortured because it's classified, and they would get in trouble because of the way the government is overclassifying. It's not national security information. It's the government using classification as a way of protecting its own corruption and fraud. But what's so scary about this is that anyone who's a journalist who tells the truth, and there's nothing wrong with this, it's journalists doing their jobs, will say, and I said this when Julian Assange was arrested, that up and down the Eastern Seaboard, in dinner parties and cocktail parties of the elite media stream, all we do all day long is talk about classified information and trade classified information, share classified information, and kind of show off when we have classified information because it means we're being effective at our jobs. That's not the same as leaking it. I do agree that someone who actually leaks classified information knows that they're breaking a law. You know, I'm not saying there's no reason not to have classification in a working democracy. But the job of journalists is to publish classified information that is brought to them that's in the public interest. And so now, if you've got the government saying, they're like literally, it's like mafia tactics. I can't believe it's come to this. The government is saying to journalists everywhere in America, we're going to intimidate you, and we're going to threaten you, and we're threatening you with serious legal penalties like prison time if you do your job. And I mean, it's like, that's what they do in China, you know? I mean, I just can't even believe it's come to this. Obviously, journalists publish classified information because that's how we know we're living in a democracy.
You brought up Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks. What do you think will happen to him if he ends up in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, obviously I believe in the rule of law, and in an ideal world, you know, he would go safely to Sweden, and you know, the women who have accused him would have their day in court. He would have his day in court, and justice would be impartial. I don't think that's what's happening in his case. I think that it's a global kind of manhunt to punish and silence a whistleblower, a publisher, again, not a leaker, a publisher.
A publisher.
A publisher. I really want to stress this. Bradley Manning leaked the material, allegedly, you know, and so he has to deal with whatever he's going to deal with.
You see Julian Assange as the publisher.
He is the publisher.
Like the New York Times,
exactly.
Similar to that.
Exactly. It's Dan Ellsberg is to Bradley Manning as the New York Times is to Julian Assange. And so I think that there's no way that he can have an impartial trial in Sweden, but quite apart from that, I'm very concerned that there's sort of meta-national pressure on Britain and on Sweden by the U.S., and there's some evidence of this. Andrew Krieg, who's a really good investigative citizen journalist, has documented a lot of this evidence that demonstrates that the intent is to extradite Assange to the U.S. and then have him be the highest profile, journalist in Guantanamo. And where do you go from there? People have been there for 10 years without charge or trial. And I think that that's not just to silence him. Again, I think it's also to send a message to anyone else who might leak, compromising or embarrassing or problematic material about the United States government.
Earlier this year, you threw your support behind a class action lawsuit filed against U.S. President Barack Obama and his defense secretary over the National Defense Authorization Act. When you were reporting about that bill, you said it, quote, included powers that could bring the authorities of Guantanamo to America's courthouses, streets, and backyards. In May, a judge suspended Section 1021 of the NDAA. You were actually in the courthouse.
It's quite amazing, and this judge, more than anyone. The National Defense Authorization Act is an absolutely terrifying piece of legislation. So Section 1021 was the section that explicitly said this gives the president the power to round up anyone without charge or trial and hold them forever. Chris Hedges, a very brave journalist, brought this forward, as well as many activists, including an Occupy activist from London. And the president's lawyers were in the court, and I was there listening to this, and to my shame, there were like 1.5 reporters in the room, none of them from major U.S. news outlets. Well, the most important thing ever to have happened to that point was happening. And the government's lawyers basically confirmed that Chris Hedges could be detained forever for reporting on the Taliban or reporting on people who could be classified as enemy combatants. They confirmed that that was indeed the case. Or if someone wrote a book about enemy combatants that in any way was sympathetic to the point of view that, the U.S. had too much power in, this part of the world, or, crazy examples of sweeping powers to detain American citizens and to criminalize dissent, criminalize journalism. And so this very brave judge listened to the evidence, which wasn't hard to miss because it was so confirmed by these lawyers that that's what this would do. And she suspended that part of it, and so saved, the Constitution where the Due Process Clause is, which guarantees everyone in America the right to a trial.
I still can't understand why this story, specifically the NDAA, has not been a bigger story in mainstream media in the U.S. This was a huge issue.
Huge.
And this bill was signed into law when people are celebrating New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve.
And then nobody heard about it on mainstream media. Why do you think that is?
Marina, I want to ask you that. When you talk to journalists, because I have friends who are journalists, senior people who are running major news sites and opinion sites, I would say, did you know that the Due Process Clause was suspended on New Year's Eve? And they're like, what? No, surely not. And they don't believe it because they didn't see, a wave of coverage, any coverage. It would be buried and obfuscated. And no one's giving these people orders to not cover it. I was listening to these historic arguments of the American president's lawyers saying, yes, we have the right to round up journalists, that journalist, we have the right to hold him forever. And there was no ABC, no NBC, no NPR, no CNN, no Fox News. Nobody was there, And the best explanation I have is denial, like maybe it's such a huge story that no one can really believe this is really happening, so we can't cover it. But I do think that what we're seeing right now, and I predicted this would happen in November of last year, is that why the violent crackdown against Occupy, why the violent criminalization of dissent, why the bullying of journalists now. I think it's linked to what we're seeing in the news right now of this huge fraud being uncovered in the banking sector. HSBC, billions of dollars in fraud, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Barclays, Bank of England, fraud, but not like marginal fraud, but clearly systemic fraud, and I just wrote a piece about this for The Guardian, clearly systemic. Tim Geithner finds out about it in 2008.
Writes an email.
Writes an email, doesn't leak the news, doesn't call a press conference, and then, becomes Treasury Secretary. So it's clear that, there's a small group of guys and girls who are in on massive fraud. And So the Occupy movement, journalists, threaten to uncover a lot of crimes if the books are ever opened. And in an email world, in an electronic world, these crimes are forever. They last forever. So that now is my working theory about why we're seeing such sudden, violent crackdown on reporting, on dissent, on whistleblowers, that otherwise a lot of people would go to jail for the crimes that they've been committing.
Occupy Wall Street is a movement that really raised awareness and pointed attention to the fact of money flowing from Wall Street to Washington and influencing policies. The economic problems have not gone away since the fall of 2011. They've only gotten worse. Occupy Wall Street, though, has sort of died down a bit. Why do you think that is?
Well, in the fall of 2011, American citizens gathered together and spoke up and protested and occupied public spaces, and they were shot with rubber bullets. They were given, lengthy jail sentences. They were arrested for staying on the sidewalk, as I was and my partner was, lawfully obeying the law.
You were arrested?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was arrested for standing on a sidewalk telling Occupy protesters what their First Amendment rights were to protest. And then we were facing 15 days in Rikers Island, which is a violent prison.
Yeah.
It makes you think twice about going out to use your First Amendment rights. I mean, Occupy protesters were, maced. They were power hosed. They were beaten. They were locked up for 17 hours and forbidden to use the bathroom. They were tortured in as much as the civil system allows. Every activist I know assumes that their emails are monitored, their phone calls are monitored. I mean, it's just a complete sense of Big Brother is a hair's breadth away. I am frightened seeing countries like Britain sleepwalking into okaying legislation to institute this kind of surveillance. But really, in Europe, people still think they have some privacy. They can go to the march and they can go home. I'm sorry to say that when you get this matrix of surveillance plus police brutality, plus laws that, suspend due process, it's very effective at breaking down protest. Now let me flip it around and say, having studied closing societies and societies that reopened democracies, mass protest is the key to reopening democracies.
Naomi Wolf, thank you very much for sitting down with our team.
Thank you, Marina.
Thanks.